At my wedding, my dad, a powerful CEO, snapped, "Take off those stupid medals. You're embarrassing everyone." I refused, and he slapped me across the face in front of 280 guests. That's when my fiancé, a four-star Navy SEAL, grabbed his wrist and said 8 words that made the whole room stand up. My dad's face turned white. I can still feel the sting. The echo of that slap, loud enough to silence 280 guests at my own wedding, still rings in my ears. But what truly shattered that day wasn't just the illusion of family, it was the raw, undeniable truth of who my father really was and who I had become. The sound cracked across the room like a pistol shot. Champagne flutes froze midair, forks hung suspended above plates of prime rib, and every single eye in that opulent hall darted between us in sheer disbelief. The sting bloomed across my cheek, hot and furious, but I didn't flinch. My medals shifted slightly with the impact, the rows of ribbons clinking faintly against each other, like they were reminding me why I stood tall in the first place. My own father, the chairman of Holstead Enterprises, a man who'd built a tech empire from the ground up and never let anyone forget it, had just struck his daughter. Not in private anger, but in public humiliation at my wedding, in front of everyone. The hall still smelled of polished wood, expensive roses, and whiskey. But all I felt was the burning on my face and the suffocating weight of 280 pairs of eyes. He'd already sneered his command once, his voice dripping with disdain. "Take off those silly medals." He'd said it like the service ribbons on my chest were cheap costume jewelry, an embarrassment to his image. I'd refused with a quiet shake of my head, chin high, posture drilled into my bones from years of standing inspection. And that's when his hand lashed out. Before I could even react, another hand intercepted him. Strong, steady, gloved in white. It was James, my fiancé, a four-star Navy SEAL, stepping between us. He gripped my father's wrist with an iron control, calm but absolutely unyielding, and leaned close enough for only a few in the front rows to hear. 8 words left his mouth, low and deliberate. And just like that, whatever power Dad thought he held evaporated. The whole room rose to their feet. It wasn't chaos. It was collective judgment. A wave of movement, a silent, powerful verdict. The CEO, who had built his empire on commanding attention, suddenly looked small. His face drained of color, eyes darting like a cornered animal. My cheeks still burned, but my pride? It didn't waver. I stood straighter. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a daughter. I was a decorated officer. A woman who had carried her weight in deserts and on decks halfway around the world. You're probably wondering how we even got here. Why a father would slap his daughter on her wedding day. Why a uniform, the one truth I had ever owned, could ignite such a furious rage. To truly understand that moment in the hall, you have to know where I came from. I grew up in a house where power was currency and love was rationed out like quarterly dividends. Dad was the kind of man who measured worth by profit margins and dinner conversations by who he could impress at the country club. He wore custom suits like armor, smoked cigars that smelled like burned leather, and drove cars that cost more than some families' homes. To the outside world, he was larger than life. To me, he was a wall I could never climb. From the time I could walk, my path was meticulously mapped in his head. Prep school, Ivy League. A seat on the board, and eventually, the corner office of Holstead Enterprises. He didn't raise children. He cultivated heirs. Or at least, that's what he thought he was doing. But even as a kid, I never fit neatly into his blueprint. While my brothers played golf and studied balance sheets, I was the one sneaking library books about military history under the covers at night. At the dinner table, when Dad launched into lectures about mergers and market trends, I'd find myself staring out the window at the flag whipping in the evening wind, wondering what it would feel like to earn the right to salute it. Dad caught me once, ironing his old ROTC uniform that had been shoved in the back of a closet. He laughed, but not kindly. "Don't waste your time on that stuff. Soldiers take orders, CEOs give them." That was his entire philosophy in a single sentence. I learned early on that in his world, uniforms were beneath suits, service beneath status, and medals? Well, medals were just silly. So why did I wear mine at my wedding? Why did I defy him, knowing full well how he'd react? Because those medals weren't just metal and ribbon. They were the story of my life. Each one was sweat, scars, nights without sleep. Decisions made in the heat of chaos. They weren't adornments. They were proof. I earned them in deserts under a sun that peeled skin from bone. In seas that tossed ships like toy boats. In nights when the only sound was the crackle of a radio and the quiet prayers of the men beside me. And I earned them in silence, too. Letters unanswered, calls ignored. Milestones met without a father's applause. The irony is, those medals carried more weight than any stock certificate Dad ever signed. They were heavy with history. They weren't for show. They were for survival. When Dad struck me, I didn't just feel a slap. I felt the culmination of decades of dismissal. The embodiment of every silence, every scoff, every time he looked at me and saw not a daughter, not an officer, but a failure to follow his script. But the room didn't side with him. Not this time. The guests, CEOs, investors, relatives, and strangers alike, rose to their feet, not in applause, but in quiet solidarity. And in that sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, I felt the gaze of those who mattered most, my brothers in arms, the seals I had bled with. Their eyes burned not with pity, but with pride. Dad's empire had always been built on commanding rooms. But in that hall, authority shifted with 8 words from a seal, with 280 people rising in defiance of arrogance. The balance of power tipped. The sting on my cheek lingered. But so did something else. Clarity. I realized I didn't need Dad's approval to validate my path. My medals, my vows, my life. They weren't his to command. Still, that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It had been brewing for years, shaped by a childhood of control, a young adulthood of rebellion, and a career carved in places Dad never cared to look. If you want to understand the weight behind that slap and why the room stood for me instead of him, then you have to know where it all began. And it began long before I ever put on a uniform. I was born into wealth, but not into warmth. Our house sat high on a hill outside Boston, a glass and stone monument to success, filled with leather chairs, oil paintings, and silence. The driveway was long enough to swallow a dozen cars, but the ride from the front gate to the door always felt longer, because you knew what waited inside. Dad, Richard Holstead, founder and CEO of Holstead Enterprises, treated the house like a boardroom and the family like employees. He believed in efficiency, discipline, and order, not affection. His daily uniform was a tailored gray suit, tie knotted with military precision, shoes so polished you could see your reflection in them. He'd march through the front door each evening like a general returning from campaign, tossing his keys on the marble table and expecting dinner on the table at 6:30 sharp. We weren't a family. We were a schedule. My brothers, 2 older, 1 younger, were groomed as heirs to the empire. Every Saturday morning, Dad took them to the club, teaching them golf swings and market trends as though a putter and a portfolio were the only tools a man needed to survive. He talked to them about investments, leverage, and legacy. With me, his only daughter, he talked about appearances. You'll be judged by who you marry, not what you do, he said more than once. So, keep your chin up, smile when spoken to, and don't embarrass the family. To him, I was a piece on a chessboard, a future bride meant to seal alliances, not someone with ambitions of her own. My mother was the soft counterweight. She loved books, art, and quiet moments that slipped through the cracks of Dad's regimented life. She read me poetry at bedtime, her voice a balm against the cold edge of the house. When I scraped my knee, she kissed it. When I doubted myself, she whispered, "Don't let anyone decide your worth, not even your father." But her voice, though gentle, was often drowned out by Dad's commands. Dinner conversations were less about family and more about stock tickers. My brothers were praised for good grades in economics, for pitching mock business plans at the table. I, meanwhile, would talk about my history projects on the Revolutionary War or my fascination with the Navy. And Dad would cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Those who can't build fortunes fight wars," he'd say. "That's not you. You're smarter than that. Or at least you could be." It wasn't just disapproval. It was disdain. There was one night I remember vividly. I was 12, sitting at the long oak table under the chandelier. My report card had just come in, and I'd proudly shown my A in civics. I explained to Dad that I wanted to join the junior ROTC program at school. I thought maybe he'd be impressed by my initiative, by my discipline. He didn't even look up from his steak. "Ridiculous," he said. "Marching around in cheap uniforms. Won't put food on the table." "But Dad," I started. "It's about service, about leadership." He slammed his knife down, silver clattering against porcelain. The room went still. "Don't waste your breath. You're not joining any program that teaches you to salute. Holsteads are saluted. We don't salute others." I sat there, cheeks burning, eyes on my plate. My brothers smirked, half in amusement, half in relief. It wasn't them in the crosshairs. My mother reached under the table and squeezed my hand. It was the only comfort I got. That night, lying awake, I decided I would remember every word, not as chains to bind me, but as fuel to prove him wrong. By high school, the gap between us had widened into a chasm. My brothers were carbon copies of him, striding through hallways in pressed blazers, already talking about hedge funds and IPOs. I was the odd one out, drawn instead to the ROTC students practicing drills on the football field, their boots hitting the pavement in sharp rhythm. When I told Dad I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy, he reacted as if I'd announced I was joining the circus. "You're throwing away every advantage you've been given," he barked. "Do you know what people will say when they hear my daughter is crawling through mud instead of running board meetings? They'll laugh at you, at me." "I don't care what they say," I replied, my voice trembling but steady. "This is my choice." He stared at me for a long moment, then delivered the sentence that would ring in my ears for years. "If you walk down that path, don't expect me to walk beside you." And he meant it. Still, I wasn't deterred. At night, I pored over academy applications, memorized regulations, and pushed myself through runs long before sunrise. My mother helped, quietly, slipping me brochures and study guides, encouraging me when Dad wasn't around. She knew I needed to break free from the gilded cage. The day my acceptance letter arrived from Annapolis, I ran into the living room, heart pounding, the letter trembling in my hands. Mom cried with joy. Dad didn't. He just stared at the envelope for 30 seconds before muttering, "So, you're serious about this nonsense?" Then he walked out of the room. He didn't speak to me for 2 months. It was my first real taste of silence as punishment, and it stung more than shouting ever could. Looking back, I realized Dad never raised his voice because he didn't need to. He ruled with presence, with expectations that hung in the air like smoke. You either lived up to them or you were cast out. I was already halfway to being cast out. But as much as it hurt, that house taught me something important. Power without empathy is hollow. Dad's empire was vast. His influence undeniable. But his family lived in fear, not love. And I knew deep down that wasn't the legacy I wanted. I wanted to build something different. Not a company, not a fortune, but a life anchored in honor. That's why when the academy acceptance came, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags, kissed my mother goodbye, and walked away from marble floors and chandeliers into a world of steel bunks, 5 a.m. drills, and uniforms Dad called silly. It was the hardest choice I'd ever made. But it was also the first step toward the aisle I would one day walk, medals gleaming, Dad glaring, and 280 people watching as our worlds finally collided. The summer before I left for Annapolis, the house felt colder than ever. It wasn't the air conditioning. It was the silence. Dad barely acknowledged me. At breakfast, he'd read the Wall Street Journal like I didn't exist. At dinner, he asked my brothers about internships and market trends, but never once turned to me. It was as if I'd already been cut out of the Holstead family portrait. One night, I overheard him on the phone in his study. His voice carried through the heavy oak door. "She's throwing her life away," he said. "Joining the Navy is no better than flipping burgers. Don't expect her to last a year." The words hit harder than if he'd shouted them to my face. I stood in the hallway, fists clenched, memorizing every syllable. That was Dad's way. He didn't argue, he dismissed. And in his dismissal, he hardened my resolve. Annapolis was everything he said it would be, grueling, unrelenting, and merciless. But what he didn't know, what he never understood, was that I thrived under pressure. The first weeks nearly broke me up before dawn, running until my lungs burned, push-ups until my arms trembled. Inspections where a single wrinkle in your uniform could mean hours of extra drills. I remember standing in formation, sweat dripping down my spine, hearing an instructor bark in my face, "You think daddy's money can get you through this? Think again." I wanted to yell that I'd walked away from all that. But I didn't. I just gritted my teeth and endured. Every insult, every punishing drill was fuel. There were nights I collapsed into bed, muscles screaming, wondering if Dad was right, if maybe I wasn't cut out for this. But then I'd picture him smirking over his scotch, telling colleagues his daughter had failed. And the thought lit a fire in me. Failure wasn't an option. By sophomore year, I started to find my rhythm. I studied harder than I ever had in my life. While others went out drinking, I stayed in the library, memorizing strategy, logistics, history. I ran until my legs felt like steel. Slowly, I rose. Not because I was the strongest, but because I refused to quit. I'll never forget my first promotion ceremony. My commanding officer pinned on my new bar, and for the first time, I felt the weight of responsibility press into my shoulder. I called home afterward, voice full of pride. The line rang and rang and rang. No answer. So I mailed a photo of the ceremony. Weeks later, I got a single envelope back. Inside wasn't a note of congratulations. It was a clipped article from a business magazine about my brother's internship at Goldman Sachs. A yellow sticky note in Dad's handwriting said, "This is what success looks like." I tore it in half. The divide only widened. My father's world revolved around profits and prestige. Mine revolved around service and sacrifice. Each holiday homecoming turned into another battlefield. He'd sit at the head of the table, swirling bourbon, and ask, "So, still playing soldier?" "It's not playing," I'd reply. "Medals don't pay mortgages," he'd snap back. Mom would intervene, voice calm but firm. "Not everything has to be about money, Richard." He'd scoff, retreat into silence, and I'd leave the table with my appetite gone. The truth was, I had found a new kind of family, one forged in fire, not blood. My classmates became brothers and sisters. We endured together, sweated together, picked each other up when we fell. There was no boardroom hierarchy, no stock options. There was only the mission and whether you could be trusted to carry it out. Graduation was bittersweet. I stood in dress whites, cap tucked under my arm, as the band played and the crowd cheered. Rows of proud families waved flags and snapped photos. I scanned the stands, searching for one face I knew I wouldn't find. Dad hadn't come. Not for the ceremony, not for the commissioning. Not for the moment his daughter officially became an officer in the United States Navy. Mom was there, though, dabbing tears from her eyes. She hugged me so tight afterward I could barely breathe. "He's wrong about you," she whispered. "You've already proven more than he ever has." Her words stayed with me long after she was gone. Deployment followed quickly. My first assignment was Okinawa, far from the glittering skyscrapers Dad loved to point to as symbols of power. The days were long, the nights longer, and the work wasn't glamorous. Logistics, supply chains, endless paperwork to keep operations moving. But it mattered. Men twice my size had to answer to me, and I learned to project authority, not with volume, but with clarity. The first time I commanded a unit in the field, the nerves nearly swallowed me whole. But I remembered the countless times Dad had told me I wasn't enough. And I decided right then I would never let his voice be the last word on my worth. Years passed. I collected not wealth, but ribbons. Each one a testament to survival, to endurance, to moments Dad would never understand. When I dragged a wounded comrade across a field of fire, when I patched him up under the roar of gunfire, when I refused the stretcher despite shrapnel in my side, those weren't just acts of duty. They were acts of defiance against the man who said I couldn't. And with every scar, with every medal pinned to my chest, I felt the distance between us grow wider. He had his empire of glass and steel. I had my empire of grit and loyalty. He never visited, never called, never once said he was proud. But I stopped needing him too. Because by then I had built something stronger than his approval. I had built myself. Combat is never the way movies frame it. No swelling music, no clean lines between heroism and fear. It feels like 1,000 decisions made at the speed of breath. Some you remember forever, some you only realize later saved a life. I learned it the hard way on a night when the sky over the Gulf looked like oil and the radio sounded like a heartbeat skipping out of rhythm. We'd been running a joint exercise that turned into a real-world scramble. Intel shifted, a friendly convoy veered too far off a safe route, and the desert decided to swallow our plans whole. I wasn't supposed to be point. I was the one the clipboard loved, the one with maps and manifests and the unglamorous job of keeping every line humming. But when a truck's axle snapped and its driver went quiet on comms, I was the one closest with the authority to move. I didn't ask permission. I moved. I still remember the heat coming through the soles of my boots as if the ground had teeth. A medic and I slid behind the disabled vehicle, and I felt the world shrink to a small circle of dust and pain. The driver was pinned under the dash, conscious, bleeding, trying to apologize for inconveniencing us. People apologize a lot when they're dying. Part of the strange politeness war beats into you. We cut him free with a borrowed pry bar. The kind of tool no one writes citations for. When the dust cleared and the helicopter roared in, I realized my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tucked them behind my back so no one would see. And then I walked out in front of my team with steady steps, because steadiness is a language leaders have to speak even when their mouths are closed. I didn't call home to tell anyone. There was no one to call. Word travels in the way it does, quietly sideways. A SEAL detachment that had watched us work started showing up at our range during off hours. At first, I thought they were humoring me. The polite nods you give to the officer who isn't one of you. But then they kept coming back, not to test me, but to train with me. They were older than me on average, scarred in the ways the body records, and reserved in the ways pain insists. And yet, around the rack of battered kettlebells and the rusted pull-up bars, we found a rhythm. I learned to shut up when they told stories and ask exactly one question when they finished. Respect, I learned, is a two-lane road with no shoulder. There was Torres, who'd run on a prosthetic like the ground owed him time it had stolen. There was Riley, whose voice never rose above a calm murmur, no matter how loud the world got. There was Hill, who smiled with one corner of his mouth and called me ma'am, like the word meant the difference between chaos and order. I didn't earn their friendship with speeches. I earned it with attendance. Showing up. Showing up again. Showing up when it rained and when it hurt and when it would have been easier to send an email instead. We started blending operations, practice first, then real. I brought structure to places that preferred mystery. They brought cunning to plans that liked to look good on a whiteboard. Once, on a night op near a coastline that smelled like rust and grief, my timeline ran red. The comm said 5 minutes to extraction, and the clock said we'd used 8. Hill's voice came over comms, light as a hand on your shoulder. Ma'am, plans are pretty until they meet the tide. Trust the tide. We did. We adjusted. We made it out, wet and late and alive. Afterward, under a steel sky, Hill passed me a thermos and said, "You kept us from sprinting into a wall." That counts. I wanted to say that his calm saved us. Instead, I nodded once, the way you do when you understand a pact doesn't need ink. I wore new ribbons after that season. The kind that don't catch the lights so much as catch your breath. I mailed a photo to my mother, a habit I couldn't quit, even though I knew the house where she lived felt more museum than home. I got a small card back in her looping script. Proud of you. Always have been. Be gentle with those who won't say it out loud. I read it 3 times, then slid it into the back of my wallet, behind my military ID, like an amulet. A month later, the call came from my father. Not to me, but to my CEO's office. Bureaucracy tends to be unkind to the personal. When I finally got the message, it was already old. Your mother's in hospice. Late stage. There was a window if I could get leave. The kind of window life often closes while you're filling out the form to request it. I flew home anyway, landing in a city that felt like an old suit that no longer fit. The house smelled the same, lemon polish and money. She looked smaller in the bed, her hair gone, her hands cool and papery in mine. My father stood at the corner of the room like a piece of dark furniture. His face composed, his tie still perfect. We didn't argue. We didn't speak. We watched the machine write its thin line of beeps like a final memo. When she woke, her voice was a whisper that threaded directly to my bones. "You look so strong," she said. "Are you strong?" I told her I was, because I had to be. She smiled the way people smile in paintings, soft at the edges. "Keep choosing what's true, even when it's not applauded." She slept, and hours later, she was gone, as gently as she had lived. My father never reached for me. I signed paperwork the way I signed orders and flew back into a world where grief is something you fold and tuck into your pocket so your hands are free. I didn't hear from him again after the funeral. Not a note, not a call. Months slid into a year. The next time the past collided with the present, it was on a pier that smelled like salt and diesel. I'd been assigned to oversee a training rotation, and the SEALs had just returned from something none of them could talk about, but all of them carried in their shoulders. Riley was limping. Hill had a bruise high on his cheekbone that looked like a map of somewhere unkind. We didn't ask. We lifted as a group and breathed as a group until the air felt friendly again. That evening, the sun dropping like a coin behind the horizon, James walked down the pier. It's strange which moments you remember with verbs and which you remember with color. I remember the light bruised purple, then gold. I remember the scrape of his boots. I remember him stopping just shy of my space, respectful without saying the word. We'd met at briefings, collided on paper, synced timelines more than once. But this was not a meeting and not a timeline. He held a small box, like it weighed more than it did. "I can't promise you calm seas," he said. "I can promise to row with you. Some proposals are fireworks." His was ballast. I said yes, because I knew he understood the difference between decoration and evidence. He'd seen me at 3 a.m., hair pinned back, uniform creased with fatigue and pride, choosing people over appearance. He loved that person. He didn't ask me to be quieter or softer or less. He asked if he could stand beside the life I had built. We planned light. A chapel, a modest reception, an invitation list of people who had earned entry by having skin in our story. I wrote a card to my father out of completion, not hope. "I'm getting married. 1,300 hours, Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform." I sealed it before I could add anything I would regret. Work did what work does. It filled the days. I stood in front of whiteboards and flight plans. Then in front of people whose eyes told me everything I needed to know about the weight they were carrying. I rewrote a training module to give instructors permission to pause evolution when the line between grit and damage grew thin. The numbers changed. Fewer injuries, fewer quiet collapses in barracks at 0300. No one gave me a medal for that. They gave me something better. Compliance without complaint. The last operation before my wedding wasn't dramatic. It was the kind that earns a footnote but saves lives, an extraction that required more patience than bravado. I rode the last truck back in, hand steady on the rail, and thought about vows. Not the flowery kind, the practical kind. Serve each other's peace, protect each other's purpose, refuse to dim the light that got us here. A week out, I ironed my dress whites with the same attention I'd give a map that would take us through safely or not at all. For stars, ribbons aligned, shoes like mirrors. I placed my mother's card on the dresser and read it again. "Be gentle with those who won't say it out loud." I wondered if gentleness would ever have a place with my father. I suspected the answer was no, but I left the question open like a window in spring. The morning of the ceremony, the base was a hush of preparation. Torres texted, "Formation outside the chapel. You walk, we stand." I replied with a single copy, the kind of word that says more than any sentiment. As I stepped toward the door, my phone buzzed, a number I knew by muscle memory. I didn't open it. Not yet. The day would have enough weather. I pocketed the device and reached for the handle, ready to walk the narrow line between past and future in boots that had learned both terrain. What I didn't know then was how small a room can make a powerful man, and how big a silence can sound when 280 people decide together what they will not tolerate. James wasn't the kind of man who needed to fill silence. He let it sit, unbothered, until it turned from awkward to comfortable. That's how I knew he was different from the men I'd grown up around. My father and brothers filled every space with noise, stock prices, predictions, instructions, corrections. James filled space with presence. We met during a joint working group at the Pentagon. He was already a 4-star Navy SEAL by then, though you wouldn't know it unless someone else told you. No flash, no chest thumping, just a steady calm that cut through the room like clean air. I was presenting on logistics reform, a dry subject that could put anyone to sleep. He listened without blinking, arms folded, eyes sharp, and when the session ended, he stopped me in the hallway. "You don't just move supplies," he said. "You move lives." It was the kind of comment that sticks, not because it flatters, but because it sees. We crossed paths again and again. Briefings, field exercises, the kind of endless carousel that keeps the military machine turning. Each time he remembered small details, how I took my coffee, how I tucked my hair under my cover, how I stayed late, not because I had to, but because something unfinished gnawed at me. He never once asked me to be less. Our first date was nothing worth a movie reel, just a diner off base. 2 plates of eggs and bacon, a waitress who called everyone honey. But I remember thinking, this is what normal feels like. No spotlight, no agenda, just 2 people who'd both seen enough darkness to appreciate the light of ordinary things. Over time, his steadiness became my ballast. He didn't compete with me, didn't measure his worth against mine. When I came home late, still smelling of diesel and gun oil, he'd look up from his book and smile as if I'd been gone 5 minutes, not 5 days. He asked questions not out of curiosity, but out of respect. "How do you keep men calm under fire? What does it feel like when a unit salutes you?" I'd shrug and say, "It just feels like duty." He'd shake his head. "No, it feels like trust. Don't minimize it." The proposal was as unadorned as the man himself. No grand gestures, no choreographed spectacle, just the 2 of us on a weathered pier in Norfolk, boots dangling over the water, gulls crying overhead. He held out a small, simple box and said, "Let me serve beside you, wherever that means." I didn't cry. I didn't need to. I just said yes. Because I already knew. When we announced our engagement, my father's response arrived, not by call or letter, but by silence. Weeks later, when I finally saw him at a family gathering, he cornered me near the bar. His glass of bourbon glistened in the low light. "You'll wear a proper dress," he said flatly. "Not that costume. Not in front of my friends. You won't embarrass me." "I'm not marrying you," I replied. "I'm marrying him, and I'll wear what tells the truth." His jaw tightened. "Do you understand how humiliating this is? People will whisper. They'll laugh at you, at me." "Then let them laugh," I said. "At least I'll know I'm not lying." He turned away, muttering into his glass. But I knew the battle lines were drawn. Planning the wedding was simple by design. James didn't want a circus, and neither did I. We chose the Naval Chapel, clean lines, stained glass that caught the morning sun, pews worn by years of hands and prayers. The guest list was modest, close friends, comrades, a few family members I still spoke to. The SEALs heard about it, of course. I never invited them formally, but one by one, they told me, "We'll be there." Torres grinned, his prosthetic leg tapping the floor. "You walked us through hell. We're not letting you walk to that altar alone." I tried to argue. They shook their heads. Non-negotiable. A week before the ceremony, I wrote a card to my father. Not out of hope. Hope had been wrung out of me long ago, but out of completeness. The words were short. "I'm getting married this Saturday. 1,300 hours, Naval Chapel. I'll be in uniform." I sealed it before I could second-guess myself. The night before the wedding, tradition kept James and me apart. He stayed with a close friend. I stayed in base quarters. At midnight, I ironed my uniform. The one truth I had ever worn. Each ribbon aligned, each button polished, shoes reflecting the ceiling lights like pools of water. As I smoothed the cuffs, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from a number I knew by heart but had never saved. 5 words. "You'll regret this tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not in shock, but in clarity. Because this was exactly who he was and exactly who I was not. I placed the phone face down, pressed one last crease into the white fabric, and whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow, I walk as myself." The morning dawned, sharp and clear, the kind of navy blue sky you only see in spring. My stomach was steady. I'd face mortars and machine guns. What was one more confrontation with a man who had never believed in me? Outside the chapel, my team gathered in formation, medals gleaming, backs straight. Some I hadn't seen in years. All of them came without being asked. "Ready?" Hill asked quietly. I nodded. "Ready." What I didn't know was how quickly the day would tilt, how a father's need for control would boil over into a moment that would silence 280 guests and leave him pale as stone. The chapel smelled faintly of cedar and polish when I stepped inside that morning, my heels striking the stone floor with a rhythm that steadied me more than any prayer could. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, splintering into shards of red and gold across the pews. It was quiet, almost reverent, as if the room knew the weight of what was about to unfold. 280 seats had been reserved, every one of them filled by someone who represented a piece of my divided world. On one side, CEOs, investors, men and women in tailored suits with smiles sharpened by years of boardrooms and balance sheets. They were my father's crowd, gathered less to celebrate me than to judge the optics. On the other side, uniforms. SEALs, Marines, sailors, men I had trained with, bled with, buried friends alongside. They weren't there for appearances. They were there for me. The tension was visible in the gap between those two groups, a gulf wider than any aisle. I stood at the back of the chapel with Hill and Torres flanking me, both dressed in their own uniforms. Torres leaned lightly on his prosthetic, his expression calm but unyielding. Hill adjusted his cuffs, then glanced at me with a small smirk. "You look like a commander about to take the field," he said. I smiled faintly. "Feels about the same." "Difference is," Torres added, "this time, we're walking with you." Their presence steadied me. I didn't need them to, but it mattered anyway. Guests whispered as they caught sight of me. The uniform was impossible to ignore. Rows of ribbons lined my chest, each one a chapter of sacrifice. The 4 stars on my shoulders seemed to shine brighter under the sunlight than the diamonds on half the women's wrists. From the front row, my father's gaze cut through the air. He was the only man in the chapel who didn't whisper, didn't shift, didn't blink. His tuxedo was blacker than midnight. His tie nodded with the precision of a man who couldn't afford mistakes. He looked like power incarnate, at least until you noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hand gripped his cane just a little too tightly. When our eyes met, he raised one brow as if to say, "Don't test me." The music began softly, an organ playing the processional notes, climbing like a tide rolling in. My chest tightened, but not from nerves. From clarity. Each step down the aisle felt less like a bride's walk and more like a march into the truth. The SEALs had warned me, "We'll stand if anyone so much as looks at you wrong." I believed them. They weren't men of empty threats. Halfway down the aisle, I caught sight of James at the altar. He wore a clean navy blue suit, simple, grounded, like him. His eyes shimmered when he saw me, not with surprise. He'd known I would wear the uniform, but with something deeper. Respect. Belonging. For the first time in years, I felt the pieces of my life align. But even before I reached him, the storm broke. Dad rose from his seat in the front row. The movement slow, deliberate, designed to draw every eye. He stepped into the aisle, forcing me to stop short. A murmur rippled through the room. The organ faltered, the notes cutting off like a breath held too long. He looked me up and down, his lips curling into a sneer that carried more disdain than words ever could. Then he said it, voice loud enough for the entire chapel to hear, "Take off those silly medals." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. The crowd tensed. I could hear someone in the back gasp. My throat tightened, not with shame, but with the weight of every year that had led to this moment. I straightened my spine, meeting his gaze without flinching. "No," I said simply. For a beat, the world held its breath, and then his hand shot out. The slap came faster than I expected, a crack that echoed off the stained glass. My cheek burned. My head snapped to the side, but my footing never faltered. Gasps erupted. A glass shattered somewhere near the back. For a split second, the room froze in disbelief. Before I could react, James moved. He stepped forward, his hand locking around my father's wrist with a grip that brooked no argument. Calm, steady, deliberate, the way only a man who had stared down worse storms could be. He leaned in, his voice low but sharp enough to cut, 8 words that silenced the room. The entire chapel rose to their feet, not in chaos, not in shock, but in solidarity. My father, the man who had built his life on commanding boardrooms and bending crowds to his will, stood pale and trembling in front of 280 witnesses. And for the first time, the empire he'd built meant nothing. I didn't look away. My cheeks still stung, but my pride stood taller than it ever had. That was the moment I realized the aisle wasn't just a path to marriage. It was the battlefield where my father's world and mine finally collided, and he was losing. For a moment, the chapel was utterly still. My father's hand hung suspended in James's grip. The silk cuff of his tuxedo crumpled in the iron grasp of a man who had led warriors through fire. Dad's face, normally flushed with power, with a certainty that every room belonged to him, went white. His eyes flicked from me, standing tall in my uniform, to James, whose calm voice had just delivered 8 words that would follow my father the rest of his life. You just struck a decorated U.S. Navy officer. 8 words. Simple. Undeniable. Lethal in their truth. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of 4 stars and the authority of every man in that room who knew what it meant to serve. The silence broke with the sound of 280 people rising as one. Suits, gowns, uniforms, all on their feet. No one instructed them. No one asked. They stood because they knew where honor belonged. My father tried to speak, his mouth opening like a man about to launch into a boardroom tirade, but no words came. He had spent his life controlling narratives, silencing dissent with money and intimidation. But this wasn't a conference table. This was a chapel filled with people who measured worth not in dollars, but in sacrifice. James released his wrist with deliberate care, as though letting go of something fragile, or something already broken. Dad stumbled back half a step, rubbing the place where he'd been held. The imprint of humility etched deeper than any bruise could show. I could feel my cheek still throbbing from the slap, but the pain no longer mattered. It had transformed into fuel. I turned to face the crowd, ribbons glinting, medals catching the fractured sunlight pouring through stained glass. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on trial. My father was, and the verdict was plain. One of the SEALs, Torres, leaning on his prosthetic, broke the silence with 3 words that rang louder than the organ ever could: Admiral on deck. The room responded instantly. Every military man and woman snapped to attention, saluting with crisp precision. Even some of the civilians followed suit, awkward but sincere. The air was thick with reverence. The kind you don't fake, the kind that can't be bought. My father's empire had never inspired this. Not once. I looked at him, then really looked. The man who had dismissed my dreams, who had cut me out of conversations, who had silenced me with disdain. He had thought today would be his triumph, his day to parade his wealth, his influence, his carefully curated image. Instead, he was pale, trembling, diminished under the gaze of people he could never control. He'd always told me medals were silly, but in that moment, they were the only truth that mattered. I walked the rest of the aisle, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. James waited at the altar, his eyes steady, pride written across his face. As I reached him, Hill and Torres stepped back with crisp dignity, their escort complete. The chaplain cleared his throat, his voice unsteady at first, then strong. "Shall we continue?" I nodded once. The ceremony resumed, but nothing about it felt small. Every vow, every word carried the weight of what had just transpired. When James took my hands and promised to serve not just my body, but my peace, I felt the sting on my cheek fade into something far greater: vindication. At the reception afterward, whispers ran through the crowd like wind through tall grass, people standing in quiet conversation. But no one dared laugh. No one dared diminish what had happened. My father left quietly before the cake was cut. No grand exit, no parting speech, just a man slipping into the night, stripped of the authority he once thought unshakable. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to, because the truth had already been spoken, witnessed, and sealed. Later that night, James and I slipped outside for air. The moonlight spilled across the water, soft and silver. He touched my cheek gently, his thumb brushing the faint red mark. "Does it hurt?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not anymore." He smiled. "Good. Because what people will remember isn't the slap. It's how you stood." And he was right. That's the thing about revenge. People think it's about destruction, about crushing those who wronged you. But the most powerful revenge isn't loud or violent. It's standing so tall that the people who tried to break you can no longer look down. My father will always be a rich CEO. That's his legacy. But mine? Mine is different. Mine is honor earned in deserts and seas, carried in scars and ribbons, saluted by men who never once asked me to be less. And when the world rose that day, not for wealth, not for power, but for respect, it wasn't just my wedding. It was my reckoning. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you weren't enough, remember this: honor doesn't come from blood or titles. It comes from what you've endured, what you've built, and the truth you refuse to take off, no matter who demands it. It comes from who stood for you when others didn't, who saluted you not because they had to, but because they chose to.